Hello. We all have one in our pocket, the good and bad of the internet at our fingertips. This morning we'll talk about how we grapple with what happens online. Everywhere and everyone. Our lives are lived online. But can we control the dark corners of the web?
What I want to be really careful of is that there aren't headlines saying Kate Winslet attacks big tech. I do wish that our government would crack down on it. I do wish that there would be certain platforms that were banned before a certain age.
The government's giving it a go.
Anybody that tells me that it's going to be too complicated for these companies that have been prioritising profits over people are misled.
Yet did the big tech firms win over families desperate for help?
Without a change that regulates the companies to operate their platforms more safely, these tragedies will continue to happen.
The Tories are in trouble, battered at a by-election in Chester. Rishi Sunak needs something to go right. We have one big question this morning. Whose job is it to keep us safe online? He's been the Chancellor, the Education Secretary, and you might know him as the Vaccines Minister. Nadhim Zahawi is now the chair of the Conservative Party, and he's here. The MP who'd be in charge of our kids' education if Labour takes power joins us too. Bridget Phillipson, Labour's Shadow Education Secretary. And later, that conversation with a mega star about life online and beyond, including her new Hollywood film. Could it be the biggest movie of all time?
I think it probably will be. I mean, those themes of climate change and, the impact that man is having on the environment, it's never been more prevalent.
And with me at the desk for the next hour, a formidable gang to talk about what's going on in the virtual and the real world. The founder of Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales. The director of Bridget Jones 2, now member of the House of Lords, Biban Kidron, who gave up the glitz to campaign for kids' protection online. And the boss of the UK's biggest tech retailer, Currys, Alex Baldock. Hello and a very warm welcome to you, whether you're watching on BBC One, on the news channel, on your phone or your laptop, because we're going to spend a lot of this morning talking about something that really matters that's happening right now. Not the World Cup, we'll get to that a bit later on. But this week, ministers unveiled their new and they hope improved laws to regulate what happens on the internet. The online safety bill will be back in Parliament tomorrow with its backers and its critics. Let's have a quick look first at what the bill does. There'll be a regulator for the first time overseeing the tech platforms, and it will have the power to fine them billions of pounds. But there's no definition of what might do harm to adults that's not illegal. And in some scenarios, the bill would let the government tell companies to use technology to examine our private messages. It's a huge bit of legislation and it could make a really big difference in the future. But firstly to you, Baroness Kidron, you've been campaigning on online safety for a long time. What's your feeling about the bill?
Well, I mean, thank goodness it's here now and we're going to get it back tomorrow. It's been 5 years in the making, and that is 5 years too long, right? But I think that having a lot of last-minute changes of this magnitude means that we in the Lords want to have a bit of a close scrutiny of what it happens. And I know for a fact that we will be bringing amendments, certainly to make sure that anywhere that a child is likely to be is in scope of the bill. You cannot expect a parent or a child indeed, to work out whether they're on a user-to-user platform or a search platform or a gaming platform. That's not okay. And also tomorrow, a number of bereaved parents, one of whom you saw in your introduction, Ian Russell.
Molly Russell's father.
Yes, he'll be coming to Parliament to back an amendment that I have that would make sure that data would be given to coroners and to families in the case of the death of a child, because many, many families have struggled for years to get hold of information that they need to understand the circumstances of the death of the child.
And there's such distress for some of the families that have been caught up in all of this. Overall, I know you're pleased there's legislation, but do you think it does go far enough to protect people?
I think people is a big question. I think on the kids piece, we need to make sure that it is actually the features of the companies themselves that are in sight of the regulator. Yeah, we mustn't concentrate only on content. So really welcome the Law Commission work on illegal content, really welcome having a regulator to look at this, but we actually really need to see what are the drivers to those bad experiences. And again, we see it's actually the features of the platforms rather than the content
itself. So it's
itself.
how it works. I mean, why the internet is fun, Jimmy, is also sort of why it's dangerous. I mean, you created a global web sensation. When you look at what the government's trying to do, who's really in charge here?
Well, I mean, it's a really complicated question, and I think one of the things is how the platforms work is really crucially important. And obviously, Wikipedia is very much a social platform, but the way it works, the way it functions, the way our community works is completely different from anywhere else. We have community elected moderators who make decisions about content. They block people, not just for violating terms of service, but for just not being here to build an encyclopedia. And we haven't had the kinds of problems, partly because we've always said Wikipedia is not a wide open free speech platform. We're a project to build an encyclopedia. So our concern is always when legislators approach the issue only thinking of the big platforms like Twitter and Facebook, they may not think about other platforms and how they operate.
And Alex, as someone who runs a big business, I mean, are you comfortable with the government regulating like this? It's a huge new piece of regulation into private business.
It is, and as ever, there's a search for balance, I think, that needs to be here. I mean, on the one hand, of course, technology is a powerful tool, and we don't allow children unfettered access to cars either.
Yeah.
On the other hand, technology can be a powerful tool for good. And what I hope in the commendable search for a way to protect people from technology's abuses, what we don't do is tip over into either restricting legitimate free speech, which is essential to the healthy running of any democracy, but also that we don't tip over into demonizing technology, which can play such a powerful role in enriching millions of lives.
And are you concerned about that as things stand?
I'll have a close eye on it, certainly.
Okay, well, all three of you, thank you so much for now. There'll be plenty more conversation with you later in the programme. Let's have a quick look at what else is making the news in the front pages. And they're split really in two ways this morning. The tabloids, no surprise, lots about two different Harrys. Harry Kane there on the front page of the Mirror, but every single other paper in this graphic looking at what's been going on with Harry and Meghan after their Netflix trailer dropped this week while William and Kate were in America. Look at the broadsheets though, they take some different lines. The Telegraph talking about pharmacies possibly being brought in to help cope during the NHS strike. The Sunday Times talking about the Tories' panic over asylum laws, and The Observer also referencing one of the strike's ministers being accused of spoiling for a fight with nurses over pay. And whatever the government does with the online safety bill, they can't escape all of those political problems. The reality right now is that the going is tough, extremely tough, with very low levels in the polls for the Conservatives seeming to become the norm. They were tested at a by-election this week, which no one expected the Conservatives to win in Chester, but it was still a pretty abject defeat for them. Notable because it was Rishi Sunak's first real-life test at the ballot box. Labour's new MP, Sam Dixon, got more than 60% of the vote. We've been talking to some of her backers in Chester who used to support the other side.
Do you mind me asking how you would normally vote?
Conservative.
But this time?
Sorry.
People are fed up with the incompetence, the dishonesty, and the fact that they have basically run the country down into the ground over the last 12 years.
The general public have just been let down by them. It's the shenanigans that have been going on in Parliament.
Well, the Conservative Party chairman, Nadhim Zahawi, is with us in the studio for the first time. Welcome to you. No one would have expected the Tories to hold Chester or to take Chester in these kinds of circumstances, but it was a pretty abject performance, wasn't it?
It was, and there is no shying away from the fact that obviously the internal challenges of the Conservative Party has probably led to the gap in the polls. But when you look beyond the headline of the 20-point gap, when we ask people, and I know a little bit about polling, I think, if there's an election tomorrow, which way would you vote? They know there's no election tomorrow, and it's a reflection on how they're feeling about their government's performance. Now, if the exam question for Rishi Sunak was, stabilise the economy, have a fiscal plan that helps the Bank of England deal with the sort of monetary levers it needs to pull to bring inflation back down, the pound is at $1.2223. The interest rate spread is down to about 3% from a peak of 6.8%. So we're fixing the economy. We've got to make sure we deal with the issues around the NHS.
But voters don't like it. I mean, that's the point. The exam question is not, does Rishi Sunak please the markets? That's an important issue. We've talked about it a lot in this studio in the last couple of months. But the question here was, Conservative voters went the other way. And did you send any cabinet ministers to go and campaign in Chester?
So I was campaigning in Chester with our brilliant candidate
Did any
there,
of your
Liz.
cabinet colleagues go?
But my point being, look, we're never expecting to win Chester. Most of the polls suggested that we're 17 points adrift in Chester. I think we came in about 13 points behind. That's no consolation in any way. That's not something to be happy with.
But if you were the only cabinet minister to go and campaign there, it feels a bit like you've sort of given up.
No, not at all. What I'm saying to you is it's a rebuilding exercise. We're focused on the local elections now in May next year, and then of course to make sure we deliver, because you have to deliver on fixing the economy. The Chancellor talked about the growth agenda, which we have to deliver against, and the best supply side intervention you can make is on skills, and the Prime Minister is focused on skills and innovation and investment in infrastructure for places like the West Midlands in my area and others. And then of course you look at the NHS, the 2-year waiting list we've dealt with. By next April, the 18-month waiting list.
I don't think many people watching would think that you're dealing with waiting lists in the NHS.
It's a difficult time.
But isn't the point here, Minister, that voters aren't listening? They're not impressed with what they've seen so far from Rishi Sunak. And it's not just voters who are walking away from you. Some of your colleagues are too. I mean, Sajid Javid, someone who our viewers will be very familiar with, who had lots of cabinet jobs in his time, a very experienced politician. He's just the latest in a long line of MPs to say, you know what, thanks very much, but I'm off at the next election. It does feel like there are many people looking at the Conservatives and thinking, that's not for me.
Well, Sajid is a huge talent, a friend of mine. He's also said in his letter that he will continue to contribute to Parliament and our democracy in different ways.
Did you try and stop him leaving?
No, hold on a second, Laura. Right, you know, because you've been around politics for a long time, that MPs will, when it comes to general election, decide to retire, make up different decisions, not just in our party, in the Labour Party as well. Lots of MPs have retired and are retiring. Luciana Berger and others, I can name you lots of
Well, she left
MPs.
for some quite specific reason.
I hear you.
But you can't deny.
Let me just get to this point. Let me just get to the point.
Make your point, and
Since Rishi Sunak took office, in central office, the phones are ringing. We've got some great candidates coming forward, which I will in time be able to announce, and I hope to come back on your show, and we'll have the same length of time to discuss the talent that is coming through in the Conservative ranks as well.
Have you spoken to other MPs who are thinking about leaving? Any of them who might be thinking about joining the Reform Party, which is what came out of the Brexit Party?
No Conservative MP has spoken to me about joining any other party. MPs will make decisions about what they do. We've asked all MPs to indicate by Monday what they plan to do in terms of if they want to stand again, because it's right that we begin selecting early. So we've got some great candidates coming through, as I said. And the most important thing is to focus on the economy, of course, making sure we deal with the backlog in the NHS, which I know Steve Barclay is doing, and dealing with the illegal small boats. This is a real issue that we have to make sure we break the business model of those gangs. And Rishi Sunak, in the first few weeks of coming into office, signed a deal with his French counterpart to increase the number of patrols. They've already turned back about 30,000 people, but we need to do much better. We need to operationalise Rwanda. That has to happen. Lots of delivery. We have to show by doing, as we did on vaccine. Remember when I took on the vaccine task, we were losing 1,200, 1,500 people a day. People were in despair. We didn't even know we were going to have a vaccine or not, but we saved the country. And Rishi delivered £400 billion of help to households.
And your record on that has been discussed on many, many occasions. But there is something else that the government is having to confront in a very real way that is going to be a huge deal for everybody watching this morning, is a wave of strikes that is coming. Now, ministers have had plenty of warning that this was going to happen, and yet there don't seem to be proper negotiations going on. There doesn't really seem to be any chance of calling these strikes off. What are you doing?
Well, that's not correct with respect, because we can take them each individually, whether it's the transport unions or other unions. The one thing I would say is that President Putin has used energy as a weapon because he's failing in his war, his illegal war in Ukraine, and he knows that energy is a weapon. So gas prices spiked. The OBR in the autumn statement said that the bulk of the reason we have this high inflation at 11% is because of energy.
Except, Minister, you know as well as I do, as many of our viewers do this morning, too, many of them public sector workers themselves, this is also about long-term pressures on public sector pay, long-term pressures in the NHS.
No doubt.
Of course, nobody would deny that President Putin's illegal war in Ukraine has exacerbated all of this, but you cannot just say that is all this is about. So why has the government allowed the country to get to the stage where there is conflict between the government and so many different important public sectors that's likely to result in really significant disruption for members of the public?
And you mentioned the NHS, and let me just address that head on. But what I was trying to say on Putin is if we allow inflation to be embedded, you hurt the most vulnerable, because actually ultimately it puts pressure on their household budgets. If inflation continues to run high, the way you deal with that is by bearing down on inflation and therefore being disciplined about public sector and private sector pay.
What are you going to do about these strikes, though? Because it looks like they're going to happen. Tell our viewers,
Laura,
what are you going to do?
You asked me a question and you said it's been going on for a while, and you mentioned the NHS. So let's take the NHS and nurses. Last year, when there was a public sector pay freeze, the government said the nurses who've been working unbelievably hard deserve 3%, whilst the rest of the public sector was frozen. This year, the public sector pay review bodies recommended £1,400, which would mean that the starting salary of a nurse would hit about 31,000, and we've accepted that. The nurses union is asking for 19%. That would cost the NHS £10 billion, £10 billion that the service should be putting on the front line to obviously bring down those elective waiting lists.
And you're explaining the context, but what are you going to do to help members of the public cope with the impact of these strikes?
What we are doing, as we've announced this morning, is we have contingency plans. We don't want to be in this world, but we have contingency plans to make sure that whether it's the health service, and there is a responsibility on the unions to make sure that there is a safe level of staffing in the NHS to deal with emergency and other aspects of the NHS. But we are operationalising contingency plans, and I was the short time I spent in the Cabinet Office as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, we've got a great team, Cobra team, that's doing this every day. So whether it's our military personnel that we've trained up, or a surge capacity that we can actually make sure things like borders are safe and protected, and of course people's lives not disrupted. We're coming up to Christmas. It's unfair, in my view, for the unions to really damage people's and disrupt people's lives and livelihoods at a time at Christmas. And they should really rethink and they should reflect on this, because that is exactly what Putin wants to see, is that division. Let's not divide, let's come together.
Unfair on their staff because pay has been held down. But I want to talk about some other things. We want to talk about the online safety bill, but just talking about whether it's strikes or what's happened in Chester. Before you became a politician, you were a pollster. Right now, what are the chances of the Tories winning the next general election?
Well, there's no election coming up. We are
It's
preparing.
not that far away.
Well, it's a couple of years, and in those couple of years, as we did on vaccine, we focus on delivery, show by doing, right? Actually, Rishi Sunak is focused on making sure we deal with the backlog of the NHS, fix the economy, safer streets, and of course those small boats. We've got to deal with illegal migration to our country. If we can demonstrate those things, then we will, I think, have a legitimate right to say to the nation, give us more time to continue that delivery. Now, just worth reminding people, as well as the 400 billion that Rishi delivered, Jeremy Hunt's just delivered a £150 billion energy package that actually protects households and businesses.
We've talked
3 million businesses.
And we've talked to him about this in that very chair.
You have indeed.
And I want to talk about online safety, because we know people are very interested in this, and the government's bill is back in the Commons this week. Let's talk about how the rules might actually work. If an England player gets knocked out of the World Cup, if England gets knocked out of the World Cup, and a footballer is then sent bananas by people on Instagram as a form of racist abuse, what power does he actually have to do anything about that?
So you're absolutely right. And I remember during the Euros, and I'm a big football fan, the racial abuse of footballers is completely unacceptable. What we're trying to do is, and your panel mentioned it, is that balance between freedom of expression, free speech, and illegal, abusive behaviour. And the way you deal with it is to make all that behaviour. So let me give you an example.
Well, can you answer
self-harm
that
videos.
example? But can you answer
that's
that
illegal.
example?
Then that person should be prosecuted for racist behaviour.
That would be a crime?
I think if you're being racially abused, that is a crime.
Because one of the concerns that many safety campaigners have about the bill is that actually the regulator will not define the kind of material that might come in a grey area, this idea of legal but harmful. And there are plenty of examples where actually it may not be clear if something is illegal or not. And by stopping short of giving those definitions, there's a concern that you've let the platforms off the hook.
I don't believe that. This is a landmark bill. When I was Education Secretary, I hauled in the tech companies with the Children's Commissioner. And by the way, the bill now embeds the Children's Commissioner and that protection for children, which is so important. I've got a young daughter, and I absolutely have no problem with her dealing with challenging issues online, but not damaging issues
and do you
online.
Do you let your daughter go on TikTok, on Snapchat, on those social media platforms?
Well, she's still 10, so there are policies, of course, on those platforms that children only at the age of 13, and I think it's important to make sure that the platforms, many of them have it in their T's and C's, but they're not really implementing it. They're not really effectively walking the walk. It's all there. What we've got to do for both children and adults, I think, is make sure that things like self-harm images should be illegal, and that's how you deal with them. But the right balance to strike is between that, free speech and freedom of expression, as well as dealing with this. Many democracies, by the way, are looking to us and this bill to follow our lead on this. So I'm very proud of what we're doing at the moment. And I think actually we've struck the right balance. Michelle Donner's got the right balance now, and I think that will be reflected, I hope, in the debate and the discussion, ultimately becoming an act of Parliament.
And very briefly, Baroness Kidron mentioned tomorrow she's going to try and make a change in the House of Lords, whereas families who have lost children, in part due to a result of what happened on social media, will get the data that they want from companies. Would the government accept that change?
Well, Michelle and the team will look at all amendments and will respond to them as through the passage of the bill through Parliament. We want to get this right. This is the important thing, which is why I go back and say to you, online, self-harm images should be illegal, and that's how you deal with them. And I think that's how you make sure that the platforms then are implementing the measures from the bill.
Okay, Nadhim Zahawi, thank you so much for coming in this morning. It's great to have you in the studio. Now, as we were hearing from Nadhim Zahawi, the government is trying to get grips with what happens on the internet. We know how much the online world is part of our real worlds, the fabulous side of it and the fear too. And it affects everyone, even Hollywood stars. Kate Winslet is one of the brightest of them, and her latest working alongside her real life daughter. What was that like?
What's the matter?
Nothing.
Okay. You are not judged. You are not criticised.
Well, I am, though, am I not?
Driving me to do this!
I really think it would be worth her while if she saw a counsellor.
Where's my phone? It's what's making you ill.
It was extraordinary. It was extraordinary. And she would have days where she'd say, I can't think of anything. I don't know what to say. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I would say, don't worry, I can't think of anything. I don't know what to say. I don't know what I'm going to do. And then it just meant that we kind of held hands much more. And actually, I was just so blown away by her. I mean, she didn't need my help at all. Sometimes I could show her or introduce her to a technical trick here and there, just little things I've picked up along the way, like changing an eye line, whether you look at the camera, look at the person there, or you cheat it to there so it brings the eye line closer to little things like that no one teaches you. And she appreciated that stuff, but when it came to the acting, she'd go, I got it, I'm good. And there were times when I would say, can I just one time? No, I'm good.
And did she ever say that back to you?
She would, yeah, sometimes she would say to me things like, when you come in and you're doing that bit, can you just maybe, like, where you're standing, I don't know, but it's just really, I'd go, okay, I'll stand over there then. So it was brilliant though. And of course we had the added bonus of knowing how to push each other's buttons, which, let me tell you, we can do quite well, and definitely lent on that resource considerably when we were filming. So yeah, it was good.
A hard watch because the issues are raw and your daughter's performance is incredible. It feels like we all know a family that has had some form of this terrible distress. Do you want this film to be a warning to families about what could go wrong with social media?
I don't know if I could use the word warning. It's great that you just did, but I think we want it to be an opening for conversation. We want to create a space in which people can say, oh my God, that's us, that's happening to us. And maybe not dismiss it as, well, it's happening to everyone, you know, what you're going to do and how do you stop them? And you can't just take their phone away. And, you know, I don't have any answers. We tried to make the mother proactive in the clumsy way that she is, but through lack of not knowing what to do, she did something primal in order to step in and help, and wouldn't even have the courage to sit down with the doctor and say there's something wrong, because there's an element of strange shame, I think, around talking about mental health, as though it's the parents.
In the film, that I think will resonate so much with parents watching across the country, a moment where your character Ruth is listening at the door and she can hear on the other side Freya's phone going ping, ping,
ping,
ping
into the early hours of the morning, yeah.
And you feel that sense of powerlessness. Do you think parents do feel that they just don't have power, this sort of battle between parents and the iPhone or Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg? You have sort of families versus big tech.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's exactly what's happening. I think that parents are being rendered utterly powerless. And I think it's incredibly hard. You know, people will often say to me, oh God, Kate, how do you do it? I don't have any answers or, you know, some magic wand I can wave. You know, sometimes I wish I had a manual as well. And I've full on stared at both of my children, my teenage children at times, and thought to myself, my God, I don't know what I'm supposed to do at all. You know, it's time to phone a friend. I mean, we all have those moments. But I do definitely feel that the world of social media is frightening to parents because we don't really know what's there. We don't know how our children are using it. We don't know the effect that it's really having on them. We don't know really what's going on in their friendship groups anymore, because so much of it is actually built on phones, inside phones, this world that just, you can burrow deeper and deeper into it, and it becomes darker and trickier and much, much harder for children to navigate. And I think because young children are having phones at a much earlier age, they're able to access things that emotionally they're just not equipped or sophisticated enough to know how to process. You know, there are parents who are sifting around in the rubble of COVID going, what the hell do I do? Who is this person who used to be my lovely child? I mean, it happens, we all know these stories, you know, whether it's happened to us or we have friends who come to us and say, oh my God, what do I do? Or what do you do? I don't know, you know. It's a really frightening time to be a parent, I think.
Do you think there needs to be more regulation? I mean, should we just say social media shouldn't be available to people under a certain age, or what might be the answer?
It's a difficult one, because when you're an individual in something of a high-profile position, you know, we do have to be careful that we're using our voices wisely, hopefully telling stories that resonate, speaking with integrity, and leading with the truth. Those things are very important to me. I really do struggle with social media. I struggle with the impact it's clearly having on teenage mental health. I do wish that our government would crack down on it. I do wish that there would be certain platforms that were banned before a certain age. I wish that security checks would be much more rigorous. You know, teenagers, where there's a will, there's a way. So if they want to get on that platform, they will. But I do believe that there needs to be a lot more protection and accountability, because parents are left flailing, going, well, thank you so much, government, look what just happened to my child. And how can you possibly tell me that, oops, it's not my fault? There's people shirking responsibility all the time. That I struggle with. I really struggle with that.
Who's shirking responsibility, though?
You answer that question.
Well, is it the tech companies, or should it be the role of governments? I mean, maybe governments in a way are also struggling with this huge change.
I think what I want to be really careful of is that there aren't headlines saying Kate Winslet attacks big tech. I certainly don't want to do that. That's not what this is about for me at all. I just think that the people who know that they could do better to protect our children should just be doing that. Whoever those people are, they know who they are. They should just step up and do better.
One of the things you talk a lot, and listening to you speak, you use the word real a lot. And in real life, what's happening in this country right now is a lot of people are struggling to pay the bills. And you recently donated a large amount of money, £17,000, to a mother with a disabled child who had gone online and just said, I can't manage, I'm not going to be able to keep the lights on. Why did you do that? How did you hear about it?
Something popped up on the BBC Scotland news page about this woman, Carolyn Hunter's story, and her saying that she would have to put her child, who has severe cerebral palsy and very, very extreme needs and is nonverbal, that she was going to have to put her child into care because she could not afford her electricity bills. And it absolutely destroyed me. I just thought, on what planet is anyone going to let that happen? This is just completely, completely wrong. We were able to track her down and say that I had wanted to make a donation, and it was because of that that they then set up a GoFundMe page, and bang, I was able to do it right away. And it just felt, it was just wrong to me that this woman was going to suffer, and that she should have been in any way, as a mother, forced to make such a heartbreaking decision because she simply didn't have the support and couldn't pay the bills. I just couldn't let that happen.
Is there a place, though, for people with lots of resources to be taking that kind of individual action? You know, what does it say about us as a country that's happening?
I think people just, the powers that be need to have a good think, and they need to get it right, and they need to make changes that will actually help these people. You know, adults are great at fundraising for groups and for other adults, and sometimes for large groups of children, but I have always been really cut in half by the plight of the individual, and there seems to be very little lack of support for individuals whose situations are extreme, are different. You can't categorize them, you can't tick a box, you can't say, oh well, you're not eligible for school meals because this is ridiculous. If you can't afford to pay for your child's school meals, someone else should be paying for it. Don't let the child go hungry. Can you hear why I'm getting so passionate in my old age? But these things...
You're going to become an activist in your late 40s.
Look at me. But these things matter. I was a free school meals kid. Myself and all my siblings, we were free school meals children. And I think that Marcus Rashford, what he has done, I was watching the match the other night with my son, and I turned to him and I said, do you have any idea how extraordinary that man is? And Mum said, oh yeah, Joe said, oh yeah, he scored for this. I'm like, I'm not talking about football. I was like, let me tell you exactly what that guy did during COVID. And hats off to someone like him. And we do have to, I think, use our voices and try and at least raise awareness or ruffle feathers. We have to ruffle up the system. Why should it be the way that it is? If it isn't working, change it, fix it, do it better. Come on, people. You know, you're grown-ups. You've got the power to do it, do it.
I want to close by asking you about something completely different, where you are clearly still having huge fun in your career alongside the very gritty project of I Am Ruth, is of course the new Avatar film. Turn your skin blue, learn to hold your breath for 7 minutes, setting some kind of extraordinary record.
Yeah, don't try this at home.
And be reunited with James Cameron, who of course you worked with on Titanic.
Yeah.
It's predicted to be the biggest movie ever. Do you think it will be?
I think it probably will be. The first one was absolutely extraordinary. And I think those themes of climate change and, the impact that man is having on the environment, it's never been more prevalent and part of the conversation.
And should people see it at the cinema? Because Steven Spielberg, interestingly, at the beginning of his new film, he's giving a direct appeal to people saying, come to the movies, don't sit on your sofa at home and just watch things on streaming services.
Well, I think the ideal is to go and see it in the cinema, but it's what can people afford? That's the thing, and during COVID, wasn't it brilliant? We could all just sit there and watch what we wanted for a tenth of the price sometimes. So I think it is what people can afford, but if you can afford it, I definitely think for sure it's going to be that wonderful cinematic, all-encompassing experience that's probably worth it.
Kate Winslet, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us today.
Thank you.
Well, we've heard there Kate Winslet describe parents' distress when it comes to social media, but the government minister, Baroness Kidron, essentially saying once you get the new legislation through, it's all going to be fine.
I don't think so. I mean, I didn't think that was an adequate answer, and actually making more and more things illegal online does not necessarily give routes to justice. And it doesn't actually concentrate on the bit that Jimmy and I are talking about here, which is the features that push that bad content. So I think the government's sort of over-concentrating on the content and not enough on the actual responsibility. And I think that what Kate said there, which was just so compelling, is what my inbox looks like. Desperate parents who just feel powerless. And you go, well, of course you're powerless against a multinational organisation with the great psychologists and computer scientists who are directing your children to a given experience. Now, I do agree that children should be online, and I think it should be designed for them to be there, because it is literally their life, on, off.
So you can't lock it away.
You can't lock it out.
Alice, what did you make of what you heard?
I just pick up on that point actually about you can't lock it away, because who's going to argue against protecting children from abuse, and this is a form of abuse. Equally, we should acknowledge that there's another problem of insufficient access to technology amongst young people. I mean, we're one of the supporters of the Digital Poverty Alliance, and half of young people haven't got access to broadband at an adequate rate or affordably. A quarter of people didn't have access to computers during lockdown, and we know that being online, being connected, and the technology that allows you to make the most of that can give you life chances that are otherwise held from you. So I guess this is another dimension of balance here that needs to be in this debate.
It's such a huge landscape. But Jimmy, do you think, I mean, some people work with the government being one of the first around the world to regulate on all this stuff. Do you think there is a risk that some tech companies might actually say, do you know what, we don't want to be in the UK anymore? There have been some noises off around that.
I think that's unlikely. I think it may be hard for smaller competitors, new entrepreneurs, if we're passing rules that make it very difficult to innovate on different models and so forth. I think one of the things, simply making more things illegal isn't really the right answer when the bill doesn't contain even £1 of funding for police and social care organizations to deal with things that are already illegal, that are really underserved. Baroness Kidron mentioned paths to justice. That's really, really important. If people are being abused online, if illegal things are happening, do they actually have a way to get justice?
And I think one of the things that is missing in the bill right now is actually an independent complaints mechanism. And that's one of the things that I know that the colleagues both ends of the houses are really worried about. I mean, if you are someone who is taking on a battle with a tech company and the tech company doesn't really respond to you,
on Facebook,
where are you going to go? So I think the government is sort of, it's got this systems and processes approach, that's fine, but you have to be able to go somewhere. And perhaps the thing that is missing in this conversation is their claim to exceptionality. These are consumer-facing products. Yeah, and if it was a car, you would actually have to, be able to put a brake on, have a rear view mirror.
I mean, Jimmy, the tech bros thinking that they're somehow a special case. Silicon Valley has its own universe and its own rules. Is that how they behave?
I mean, sometimes, yes. I'm not sure. It's, again, we have to remember the internet is much, much bigger than a handful of these really huge platforms. There are a lot of different things going on out there, which makes all of this much more complicated than simply saying, here's 3 companies we need to regulate.
Do you think, though, when you look at overall at what the UK has done, do you think the government in a way stands a chance against the big platforms? I know you make the important point, there are lots of people out there, but who's really in charge of this?
Nobody's really in charge of the internet. That's just a fact. So.
Do you think that's sorry, Baroness Kidron?
No, I just think it's a really interesting question that keeps on coming up. Who's in charge? And I think that it's important to sort of separate it out and think about it like real life. So government's in charge of setting the rules. Yeah, we're in charge of electing the government. Tech companies have to follow the rules, and then actually once they are in space, I think the parents and children do have a responsibility about their own conduct. But I think that we're so far down the line with saying, oh yeah, anything goes. We can't get to basics.
Okay, very interesting. We'll watch what happens with the bill very carefully in this programme. Now, Alex, You run a huge company, I think 25,000 employees you've got, but we are seeing, and everybody's going to see impact of these strikes if these go ahead. And there's a story in the Telegraph this morning saying that Currys has dropped using the Royal Mail to do your deliveries because of their strike action. Is that, first of all, is that true?
For now, yeah. I mean, obviously our first responsibility is to the 4 and 5 UK households who want to get hold of their technology, particularly at this time of year. I mean, there's no great drama operationally for us. I mean, we plan for this sort of thing all the time, and the relatively few smaller parcels that we distribute through Royal Mail are pretty easily switchable to another provider. But there's a bigger point here, and I mean, the bigger point here is clearly, on the one hand, we see it with our own colleagues and our own customers up close, the impact of the cost of living crisis that's obviously at the root of these strikes. On the other hand, it doesn't help when our colleagues can't get to work. It doesn't help when we can't get stuff delivered to customers. And of course, a wage price inflationary spiral is simply going to make things worse for everybody for longer.
Your workers have been given, I understand, a 15% pay increase, which is above inflation, pretty massive, but over a period of time. I mean, I imagine no boss wants to have to give that kind of pay rise just because you're looking at your spreadsheets. But why did you make that decision?
Well, it's actually 16%.
16%, sorry, to underscore your generosity.
Over the past year, and nearly 40% over the past 5 years. And I'd love to say it's just because we're nice people, and of course we are, but it's also because we need to retain and motivate a workforce. And in a business like ours, it's very hard for the experience of the customer to be better than that of the colleague. And that's why we put so much attention into retaining and motivating colleagues. And what we need, obviously, is access to talent. And that's the price that we're paying for the right talent.
And how tough is the business atmosphere right now? How tough is it out there in the real economy? Of course, you've got, massive challenges like Amazon also, doing some of the same things, but in a very different way.
Well, it's quite lively out there, certainly. Yeah, I mean, it's been a lively few years for retailers, right? Because obviously you've had a violent shift towards customers buying online, and you mentioned Amazon, who in some important ways appear to play by different rules than the rest of us who actually pay some tax.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that there are plenty of UK-based retailers who are paying for the infrastructure on which Amazon are effectively getting a free ride. And now the government, to be fair to them, in the autumn statement have made some steps towards correcting that with the rates amendments, but much more needs to be done.
That's interesting. Baroness Kidron, there is a proposal that's been knocking around from the Labour Party, and we're going to talk to Bridget Phillipson from Labour in a minute, that they were apparently interested in scrapping the House of Lords. Now, you're a crossbench peer. It may now be that Keir Starmer doesn't actually want to do that straight away, but they're certainly intent on doing it. As a crossbench peer, would you vote for it? Would you do yourself out of a job?
Unusually, I am the turkey that would vote for Christmas, yes indeed. But I do want to do a shout out for my colleagues. There is such a lot of expertise and such a lot of scrutiny that goes on in the Lords that it's immensely, immensely important. And I also think that the crossbenchers who are not whipped into action, but go with their conscience and with the facts in front of them. So I would love to see an elected second chamber, but I would like it to actually include some of those capabilities, because otherwise I think we lose as much as we gain.
Okay.
I would love to see people like Baroness Kidron in the House of Lords who aren't politicians. I think we've got enough politicians. We need to preserve at least some voice for expertise in the House of Lords.
You don't want to lose that kind of quality of
Definitely
discussion.
not.
I just want to show our viewers, because you can't escape it in the newspapers or anywhere else this week, pictures of Harry and Meghan, who revealed their trailer for their long-awaited Netflix documentary this week, and they just happened to drop it at the same time that Kate and William were on a long-anticipated visit to the United States. Baroness Kidron, I know that through your work as a children's digital rights campaigner, you've had some connection with them, and they've praised your work. What do you think is going on?
Oh, I don't know what's going on. To be honest, I'm going to do something different, which is to say that both Harry and William have been phenomenal in putting my issue, the issue of child safety online, front and centre of everybody's concern. And I think that they are legitimately expert in what online abuse looks like. So let's leave it at that.
Okay, well, that was very tactfully done. I'm sure that there'll be lots more conversation about what's really going on this week across the nation, and maybe from you too, because as always, we want to hear your thoughts. What have your experiences been of trying to protect yourself or your family from less than savoury content online? As ever, you can email us at kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're social media inclined, use the hashtag BBC Laura K. We do read all of your emails, and sometimes we even use them as some questions on the programme, as you probably know by now. And you can always go to the BBC website. The address is there for you now. Now, Bridget Phillipson wants to be responsible for the education of kids in England. She'd be Labour's Education Secretary if Labour wins the election, and she's here with us in the studio for the first time this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
We've been talking a lot about online safety. Labour backs the government's plans overall, but you've criticised this idea of dropping the notion of legal but harmful. How would you define legal but harmful without hurting freedom of speech?
Yes, of course, it's a balance that you need to strike. I think overall we've been particularly disappointed about the delays that we've seen in bringing forward this legislation. The debate we're having in Parliament tomorrow was meant to have happened back in July.
But it didn't happen because Labour was trying to get a vote of confidence in Boris Johnson.
Well, because we've had chaos right at the heart of government for months now, and it's as true in this area as it is right across a range of kind of areas of government work, that we're not getting decisions taken because of the chaos that we've seen. But I think it is important that we make sure that children and other vulnerable people are kept safe online. You know, like all parents, you worry about the impact on children, and you also worry about the real problems that we're seeing right now around mental health. And that's why Labour's plan around making sure that we guarantee access to mental health, that we make sure we deliver mental health counsellors in every school, is an important part of, I think, a wider discussion that you were just having there about, yes, the online space and its impact, but what are the wider pressures that our children and young people are facing right now?
But if Labour wins the election, would you restore this idea of content being taken down that is harmful, even if it's not illegal, for adults? Would you put that back into the law?
Yeah, yes, because if you look at what that is around, it's Russian disinformation, it's misogynistic organising online, the kind of so-called incel culture. There's a lot out there in that online space that I think goes beyond the impact on children and young people, but where there is a need, I think, to make sure that we're not allowing that kind of harmful, hate-filled material to be spread, because it then translates into what happens in our lives, face to face as well.
What about end-to-end encryption, though? There are some concerns about giving the government and the regulator the power to see our private messages. I mean, would that be okay in your view?
I think there are always balances to strike in this area, and of course people have a right to privacy, but at the same time I think we have seen instances where it means that particularly in areas of national security it hasn't been possible for the government to act. So as in all of these cases, it's about making sure there's a balance and that there are kind of checks around this. But what we've got at the moment is just a Wild West, and it can't continue in its current form. I think it's a real worry for parents, and then does need to be action taken.
It does feel like the sort of beginning, certainly not the end of regulation online. Let's talk about your job as Shadow Education Secretary. Now, at the moment, Labour is making a big play of saying that you would take away the charitable status of private schools and rack up VAT on the fees. What would you say to some people who accuse you of trying to sort of stir up the politics of envy?
This is just a straightforward question of fairness for me. So private schools do enjoy considerable tax breaks. I don't think that can be justified. And we would end those tax breaks where it comes to VAT and business rates. And we put that £1.7 billion into delivering a brilliant state education for every child. My priority as Education Secretary will be to drive up standards in every corner of our country. And sadly, we do see lots of gaps that have emerged and actually have widened, particularly where it comes to young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, parts of the north overall. So government is about priorities and it's about choices. And I think if we end those tax breaks, we can make a real impact in providing more teachers in our schools and better mental health support.
But it would only raise £1.7 billion. Now, of course, that's a huge amount of money to anybody. But in the terms of government spending, I mean, that's not going to be a transformational amount of cash. And some of your critics might say what you're enjoying doing here is winding up the Daily Mail and keeping the left of the Labour Party happy by dangling this as a proposition. But actually, if you're only going to raise 1.7 billion, aren't you just going to cause a lot of disruption for parents and schools who are just trying to do what they believe is the right thing?
All parents want what's best for their children. I completely accept that, although I don't accept the spurious arguments being made by the private school lobbyists, and it's a real shame that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are parroting that bogus data around the impact and aren't prepared to stand up to the vested interests. I am, because I want to make sure that we deliver a brilliant education for every child. I think it's a substantial amount of money and would really allow us to make sure that we've got more teachers in our classrooms, that there's also better support for new heads who are coming through, because at the moment, you know, when I speak to current head teachers, they're really worried about where that next generation of school leaders will come from. So some of that money would also go towards making sure we've got that next generation of head teachers coming through. But I completely accept that will not be the entirety of Labour's offer where it comes to education. There is a lot more that needs to change from the early years, in further education, right across the board. A real shift in the culture I think we need to see around education.
But are you accusing parents who might be saving hard to send their kids to private school of being vested interests?
No, I think all parents want the best for their kids. I want the best for my children, but I also want the best for all children in our country. And 93% of children in our country attend state schools. That's my priority. But I just think it's unjustifiable, given the massive fee increases that we've seen in private schools, way above and beyond earnings in cash terms, that we use some of that money on the VAT to invest in a brilliant state education. I think that's what the vast majority of parents in our country want Labour to be doing.
But you're also writing to the markets authorities for them to investigate school fees, so it's a bit confusing, because on the one hand you're trying to squeeze the private schools for more money, and also you're trying to stand up for the parents of private school kids as consumers. It's a bit of a confusing message, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. I think because we have seen over the last 20 years substantial increases in private school fees. We haven't actually seen a reduction in the number of children attending private schools, which I do think demonstrates the weak arguments that opponents of this are making. But I think there is a case that we're potentially seeing market failure here, and I think the Education Secretary should get the CMA involved into looking into this matter. But again, are they going to stand up and do what's right, or are they in hock to the vested interests in their own party?
Are teachers right to hold out for a 12% pay increase?
I think teachers are right to argue for a better deal in terms of pay, but also wider terms and conditions. When I speak to teachers across our country, and school support staff too, who I think it's important to recognise, they tell me how demoralised they are, how they feel that they've been insulted and derided by the government during the pandemic, when I think parents know how hard teachers were working and they want a better deal.
Are they right to hold out for 12%, or is the government right to say, no, you can have 5% in England, but no more than that because it's not affordable?
They're right to argue around pay, and they're right to make the case around terms and conditions. I do think it is both together. It's come together at the worst possible time.
You've got 5% on one end and 12% on the other. Who's right here? The government doesn't want to budge. The unions don't want to budge. Would you give them 12%?
No, the unions are desperate to sit down around the table and have a conversation with ministers around this who are refusing to discuss pay. If I were Education Secretary, I'd be sat around the table trying to get a compromise in any negotiation.
But where's the compromise then? 5%, 12%? Where's that compromise? You say you'd find a compromise if you were Education Secretary.
It's often somewhere in the middle, and that's why it's a process of negotiation. It's about pay, but it's also about terms and conditions. And what teachers tell me they feel is that they're demoralised, the government hasn't had their back, and they want to know that there is hope for the future. And that's why we need more teachers in our classrooms too. They're under enormous pressure.
I want to ask you also about childcare. Now, you believe that childcare should be really a big part of the education system, and I know you've recently been to Estonia, where all kids get a nursery place from 18 months on, and parents only pay, I think, £60 a month. How would that be affordable to have it in this country?
So I was in Estonia looking at the way that they do things, and childcare and early years is a real priority for me, and it is whenever you speak to parents, because lots of women in particular, it's sadly women, are giving up jobs they love because they can't get available and affordable childcare. If you want to have a plan around growth in our country, then you have to make sure that we're giving parents choices. But also, if you want to deliver really high standards in our schools, then you need to address that attainment gap that opens up very early. So making sure that all children receive a really great start in life at the earliest possible point will do a lot to address some of those challenges that schools are facing right now.
Well, it'd be great to have you back when your plans are more detailed on childcare to hear more about it. But just finally, yes or no, if Labour wins the election, are you going to get rid of the House of Lords?
We will make sure we have an elected second chamber, absolutely.
Definitively in a first term?
That's the plan, and we'll be consulting ahead of the manifesto around how we make that happen.
OK, well, there'll be lots of conversation about that this week, because Keir Starmer's got a big announcement tomorrow, I believe. But Bridget Phillipson, for now, thank you very much for coming in this morning and speaking to us. Now, it is nearly 10, nearly time to go. That hour has zipped by, and we've spent a lot of time talking this morning about how we protect ourselves and our children online this morning. Let's hear again what the Government Minister, Nadhim Zahawi, said.
This is a landmark bill. When I was Education Secretary, I hauled in the tech companies with the Children's Commissioner. And by the way, the bill now embeds the Children's Commissioner and that protection for children, which is so important. I've got a young daughter, and I absolutely have no problem with her dealing with challenging issues online, but not damaging issues.
Now, we will keep a close eye on what happens in Parliament this week when the online safety bill is back there for discussion. But let's close this morning with talking about what's on probably quite a lot of people's minds as well. The World Cup, of course, the big England game tonight. Alex, traditionally, the World Cup means people buy new tellies. Has that been happening this time?
It has. I mean, in an ideal world, obviously we're an international business, in an ideal world we'd have semi-finals with Wales, Denmark and England all represented. Sadly, that's not going to happen. But I can just don my England shirt this evening and get away temporarily from the miseries of being a Chelsea fan.
Oh dear, dear, dear. Well, lots of people have sympathy. We can see the England team training. There's Harry Kane and Marcus Rashford and some of the other players practicing for tonight's match. Where will you be watching the football, and how big is your TV? I think people might be wondering.
The supersizing trend is a really important one, and it's not too late. I would encourage anybody to get out there and tuck in.
How big's your telly?
Mine's over 70 inches.
Oh my gosh. Baroness Kitchen, will you be watching the football? Where?
I definitely will be watching it. I want to actually say FIFA is morally bankrupt and it shouldn't be in Qatar. Any official going should be wearing armbands on both sides because they won't get a yellow card. But if they can reproduce what the Lionesses did, I will be jumping up and down on my sofa.
Jimmy, where will you be watching the football?
I'll be at home with my little girls, and we won't be on social media. We'll be watching the telly.
You'll be putting your phones down, concentrating on what's happening in front of you on the television screen. Very, very good to hear it. Thank you all so much for coming in this morning. It's been a great conversation with you here at the desk. What we've been talking about is maybe a telling example of how hard modern politics is, because you'd be hard pushed to find anyone who thinks no action needs to be taken to rein in the worst excesses of the internet. But equally, you might struggle to find any so-called solution that the tech companies would tolerate that will satisfy every parent and all the political parties. After delays, the government is planning to do something rather than nothing, and that is a landmark moment. It matters that there will be a regulator for the first time to check up on what is being published on the internet. But it's the beginning, not an ending, to the dilemma of how governments and politicians can shape what happens online. Just as some of us might feel powerless, maybe some of them do too, because technology changes even faster than the Conservatives change their leader. Thank you so much for watching us this morning on TV or indeed online, where you can always catch up on iPlayer later on. But for now, goodbye. I'll see you next week.